So in part 2 of our screencast about colonies, we're going to tackle religion and then some other ideas that are in the colonies that relate to mainly political but also economic and somewhat religious aspects of colonial development in the Americas. So with the importance of religion, I've kind of given you 3 bullet points here that just generally give an overview about religion in the colonies. First of all, many Europeans, of course, going back to where we started with the screencast, left for the Americas in search of religious freedom, or freedom to worship their way freely. An example of that would be the Salem witch trials, which the Puritans, of course, like we talked about before with Mayflower, left England to settle in America for religious freedom because they were being persecuted. But eventually, as the 1600s continue, we find them settling in an area called Salem in Massachusetts. And that's where, of course, they're going to accuse and burn women, mostly, a couple of men, but some mainly women, of being witches. And one of the reasons is because they are not following their prescribed beliefs for Puritanism. And so there is some question about full tolerance in America, in the American colonies, over religion. The religious beliefs also helped to shape colonial society and government, and a good example of that would be the Quakers in Pennsylvania. When the Quakers got their name, yeah, it's like the Quaker Oats guy, that's the same guy. The reason why they're called Quakers is because when they would have a religious experience, they would literally quake or shake almost in terms of having a religious experience, a connection with God. And that's what the Quakers were. They were very much against slavery. They were total abolitionists and oftentimes would be instrumental in helping slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. And that would help shape their society and their government, of course also their economy. Generally, there was some tolerance, at least more so than we see in England, of groups, religious groups, as Americans continued to grow and prosper. Rhode Island in particular was one of the most tolerant. It was almost like if you couldn't be accepted anywhere else in America religiously, you would go to Rhode Island. Maryland actually passed a Toleration Act, and I'm going to pause right here. And I'm going to have to pick up with Maryland's Toleration Act because I had to change that, 1949 to 1649. That would have been really too recent. But in colonial Maryland, they passed a Toleration Act in 1649, basically accepting other groups of Christians. Now, granted, it was for Christians, but it helps to set a foundation of religious freedom that we'll build upon in the Constitution later on with Amendment 1 and, of course, Amendment 14. Yes, I hope you said it out loud. Equal protection under the law. So now let's focus on Roman numeral number 5. Looking back at religion, economics, and politics, we're going to kind of look at the ideas that the English colonists brought with them to the Americas and built upon in order to create our country that we have today. If you're reading Lesson 4 in We the People, hopefully you've already seen, or you will see, the importance of the Magna Carta. Magna Carta in Latin means the Great Charter or the Great Document. And in 1215 A.D., the nobility of England forced King John I to sign this document. And it's pretty significant because this was the first time in English history that the nobility forced the king to be accountable for his actions, limiting the power of the king, basically saying, we have to follow all these laws, then you do too, king. So this is hugely significant and incredibly important. This document included the equal treatment under the law for all. And yes, I hope you're thinking about that again. Amendment 14, and you can say it out loud now, equal protection under the law. So I can't begin to tell you how incredibly important it is to remember the Magna Carta. Even remembering the date might be important in the 1200s or 1215 AD, limiting the power of the king. The Enlightenment was another idea that colonists brought with them from to the Americas from England. And those are ideas from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a time period from about the 1600s to the 1800s that really impact us in the colonies, where Europeans begin to question the authority and the power of their governments, including, of course, the king, with divine right of kings, where these kings, these absolute monarchs, believed that they had the authority from God to rule over everybody. One of those guys, and there are 4 guys listed there from the Enlightenment, one of the most important is John Locke. For us in civics, John Locke is probably the most instrumental Enlightenment thinker because he develops this idea of the social contract theory. Now, we're going to talk about this more in class because it's an abstract concept, and so we're going to practice with it. But for now, I want you to understand the social contract theory really is what it says it is. It's a contract or an agreement that's social. It's really between the people, which is the social part, and the government. Basically, by the social contract theory's definition, the government that we have gets its power to rule over us from our consent, from our agreement to let them. So we might have to give up some of our rights and freedoms, things that we might want to do, say, with, under anarchy, in order to have rules and laws that we might not always like, but provide for us and protect us as a society. John Locke also believed in this idea of natural rights, and he said, everybody has certain rights that need to be protected, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which you could find. I hope you are thinking of the Declaration of Independence right about now, with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Baron de Montesquieu was another person who was a French Enlightenment thinker. He gave us the idea of separation of powers. Do you know how many powers our government has? Those powers are really branches, is what I'm thinking of. Those 3 branches of government that are separated are legislative with Congress, executive with the president, and judicial with the Supreme Court, and those are a federal separation of powers. Basically, what Baron de Montesquieu said is that power shouldn't be coming from or centralized into one person or even one group, that's where tyranny and oppression comes from. So in our country, what we did in the Constitution is we separated those 3 powers, and then even went one further than that and gave them a way to check and balance one another. And I hope you've heard about checks and balances at this point, where, for example, even though a lot of people are really concerned about the presidential election, might not have an idea who else is on the ballot, and that's kind of scary, considering the fact that the president can't make a move pretty much without the consent of Congress. So we really should be focused on, first and foremost, who our senators and representatives are in Congress, more so than the president. Our third person here listed is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, also a French Enlightenment thinker. He supported the social contract theory after John Locke had created it, but he had a little different idea. He said that government exists to protect the rights of its citizens. So he went a little further into detail there and kind of capitalized on John Locke's ideas. And that's really where we get this idea in the Declaration of Independence, and really our foundation for government. Why does it even exist? Well, we've learned by now from Unit 1, from our studies there, that the government exists to protect your rights. And we'll go even further with the Declaration of Independence and the Enlightenment ideas in this unit and understand that we believe that when a government that we have no longer protects our rights and is detrimental to us, it's not just our right and duty, it's our obligation and a requirement for us to change it and create for ourselves a government that does protect our rights. And the last Enlightenment thinker is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, as we'll study a little bit more in this unit, are a little different. The main thing that we get from Thomas Hobbes is our need for government. Now, Thomas Hobbes really liked a monarchy, and so we're very different in our beliefs from that with Thomas Hobbes. But what we do support and what we do utilize from Thomas Hobbes in our government is the need for a government. Basically, he says we need government. And so I want you to question that about yourself. Do we need a government? We talked about that in Unit 1, and pretty much everybody said, yeah, we kind of need a government in order to provide order and security for us, and of course to keep us from killing people. I think that's what one class said. The only reason that people don't go around killing people is because of government. I'm hoping it's more than just that. But Thomas Hobbes says that need for government is really important, that we need that in order to provide order and security. So beyond the Magna Carta and the Enlightenment, some other things that the English colonists brought with them to the Americas with ideas are representation in government by what's called a legislature. We've mentioned that several times in class, but I want to be absolutely sure everybody's on the same page and define a legislature. That's a big fancy word for just a group of people that makes laws. So legislature is just a law-making group of people. Legislatures make legislation. Legislation is a fancy word for a law. A legislator is someone who is part of a legislature that makes legislation. So all those fancy words just refer to laws. Pretty simple. Now again, in Lesson 4 from We the People, we learn about the English Parliament, and it's the English Parliament that is the law-making body and the legislative branch of England, and it became the most powerful arm of the English government in the 1600s because of specifically a civil war that occurred in the 1600s, and we kind of read about that in Lesson 4 as well. And actually the Parliament in England in the 1600s becomes a little more powerful than just the king, and the king is forced to rule with Parliament. The members of Parliament in England, most of them were elected, well, part of them were elected by the people. Today, they're all elected by the people, and so that's like a representative democracy there for Parliament. Most countries' parliaments are indeed elected by the people. And well, I should say with the parliaments, like House of Lords and House of Commons, I might want to put this in here too. The House of Lords still today, there's some appointment process that you go through, but it's much more scrutinized, of course, than what it used to be in terms of just being nobility. And a lot of people want to go to either a full or a mostly elected House of Lords today, with a commonly elected, of course, House of Commons. The colonists also brought over their ideas of guarantee of citizens' rights with the English Bill of Rights, which was written in 1689, that required the king to seek the consent of Parliament before making changes that impacted the people, like, for example, taxation without representation. And they wanted to make sure that the people, if they're going to be taxed, would be able to have the consent, or at least the consent of Parliament, which had some elected officials and also some lords that were appointed as well, in order to protect the citizens' rights. And also consistency of laws in government. The English government was based on common law, and of course, if you're reading in Lesson 4, common law is basically established on customs and traditions of the law and, of course, judges' rulings. And so that provides some consistency and stability within the law and the judicial system as well. And so just to recap some of these ideas that the English colonists brought with them to the Americas, that includes the Magna Carta, also ideas from the Enlightenment from thinkers like John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes, along with ideas of representative government through a legislature, guaranteeing citizens' rights, and remaining consistent in application of the laws. Now that we've settled that, I'd like to go on to Roman numeral 6, which all good things must come to an end. And this gets us into the main causes of the American Revolution. So to ensure that colonies were prosperous with this idea of mercantilism, if you remember, power equals money, England's Parliament passed what was called a series of acts, of navigation acts is what they were called in the 1600s. In the main, the navigation acts required the colonists to trade only with England. So if they wanted to get stuff from other areas of the world, or even import that from other areas of the world, it had to go to or come from England before it went anywhere else. And that way England would be sure to extract that colonial wealth in order to maintain their prosperity. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, there's some positives and negatives where, well, it would ensure colonial prosperity along with British prosperity, because the British would take care of their colonies. And, of course, the English that were going over there to settle in the colonies and help those English colonial settlers become prosperous along with their own home country. But a lot of course, the colonies didn't necessarily do that. They smuggled some goods. But in the 1600s and the first half of the 1700s, England was involved with a war with France mainly. So England and France kind of hated each other. And because of that, England actually had this policy of what we call salutary neglect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in class as well, because it's kind of an abstract concept, but salutary means beneficial. So England didn't apply these navigation acts because it was too expensive and costly to apply that, because they were engaged in a war with France. And so what happens is that instead of going through Great Britain with the navigation acts like they were supposed to, the colonists would just kind of do their own thing. Well, that allowed, of course, for prosperity of the colonies and for Great Britain, and allowed for the colonies to almost develop by themselves. So they kind of grew up without the watchful eye of the parent of Great Britain over them so much as what Great Britain would have liked, because, of course, the French and Indian War and their problems with France. So even though the English won the French and Indian War, this actually causes a big problem with Great Britain with the idea of mercantilism, and really basically encourages Great Britain to force the colonies to pay for the war through levying taxes. And of course the colonists are not going to be happy about that. So then the question is, how do you think they're going to respond? Are they going to follow their country's laws, or are they going to protest? Well, it depends on how bad, of course, things are going to get for the colonists, and they're going to get pretty bad. So this is the end of part 2 of our colonial screencast, and in the next one we'll take a look at a review of England versus colonial America.